to be. Every separate reality, known locally as universes, is made up of an all-inclusive genetic web, sometimes with a loose thread that ends up connected to an adjoining one. What do you think accounts for some of what goes on around here when you're not watching too closely? There was once a man who undertook a survey of the mystical schools of his time and found first those primarily interested in learning to control their instincts, and as he traveled on, discovered those who were most concerned with bringing their minds to task. He, in fact, eventually came in contact with a few who were attempting both. At the conclusion of his effort, he sat down and thought, wow, In the midst of their problems, the simple seemed relieved, if not downright pleased, to be told that they're not alone therein. There was once a man born in the land of one, and as he grew, he was moved to the higher land of two, wherein most of his kind lived out their days. But this particular man, through certain efforts he developed, managed to get himself to the unusual land of three, wherein he spent many enjoyable years. But he eventually tired of it, and through some even more extraordinary exertions, broke through into the totally new land of four, which, as it turned out, contained characteristics that were similar to all of the aspects of the previous three. Upon hearing this tale, a boy asked his father, "Do you realize what this means?" And the elder replied, "Well, no." There are two kinds of individuality or personality, instinctive and mental, and the former, displayed by most sentient creatures, seems scarcely open to alteration, while those possessing the latter feel otherwise regarding theirs. On a world far away was held a race between a four-legged cheetah and a one-legged philosopher. And the philosopher won, because he could think about winning. As you move up from simpler to more complex levels, the reality of justice shifts and expands. The extent of most men's communication with life amounts to the latter telling the former, "Don't call me here." To get the full use of a phone, you must know who you're calling, know their number, and know how to place the call. Seems simple enough, but after leaving the original, instinctive Eden, man began to remember it as being a safe, peaceful paradise that it never was. The way a man looks at the past reveals the nature of his sight. A certain knight once sat down with his maps and directions and pondered, if the Grail is not an actual object, then in which area would I most profitably apply my efforts? In the world out there, of body, action, and public intercourse, or the world inside of me, the one of mind, reflection, and individual privacy, or privacy? The man with two horses has a problem knowing which one to ride, but not as much of a problem as those in the same situation who don't know that they have two mounts. Men delight in giving one another meaningless mental tests inasmuch as they're not quite sure how to take a measure of this unique capacity. Those who do not know instinctively how to live are only minimally helped by being told how to. Another drive-by shooting of civilization, I'd say, but they told me not to add. I know they told me not to be adding editorial comments. The dynamics of human discourse. The simple normally expect a response to what they say. Not very dynamic, is it? But the lame hate the idea of the dance ever ending. Men who believe that the lines leading prides have a philosophy have more to learn than one lifetime will probably provide. Lurking around his house seemed to be two creatures stalking a certain man. One of them would bite without making any sound, while the other would attack using only its noise. The man said that he's been through a lot in life, but nothing to match this. There was once a knight whose journey seemed to have progressed through several distinct stages. In the beginning, he felt himself subject to assault by forces from without, then later began to feel that he was the sole source of any aggression toward himself, which for a number of years seemed to be the definitive statement on the matter. But this particular warrior, however, ultimately passed beyond this point and found his travels thereafter less impeded by certain irrelevancies. There was once a man who attempted to take himself into his closest confidence, but discovered that it was a total waste of good time as things presently stood. One lad asked his dad, "Is it simpler to just be happy or happier just to be simple?" No. And his father replied, well, there was once a land of clocks, wherein 6 a.m. seemed to be in charge, since that was as far as time there had progressed. Yet, and you'll have to work this one out for yourself, this advanced hour was still beholding to midnight. Another distinction between knights who are just wandering about and those with some solid notion of where they're headed is that the latter, regardless of the fact that they're bare-wristed and without watch pockets, still always know what time it is in a peculiar internal manner of speaking. One man asked himself, "Which wearies me the most, thinking about things I've already done or thinking about things I've already thought?" Is it curious, after all, how seldom the enlightened bother to speak of the past? The mind can attempt to explain two worlds, the instinctive and its own mental one, but its only even partially satisfying output regards the former. A pig farmer can describe swine, mud, and slop, but not what it is internally to be a pig farmer. Life, the only goods or service that doesn't have to advertise or promote itself. Papa, is that why men say that the best things in life are free? No. Well, son, like most of the time, they got it damn near half right in a funny sort of way. The mystery in life. There are two types of mystery, pseudo and real, and only the pseudo exists. One man kept all of his apparently important stuff in the front of his house and relegated all that wasn't to the rear. He's now undertaken to try and keep himself out altogether. The simple worry about biological health, and the more sophisticated over psychological health. Yet neither one knows what the hell health really is. And a dead man of quite average intelligence says, "Well, I do." And based on that little incident, I suspect it's a good thing that we're not exposed to more comments and observations from those who flunked out of a mystical school than we are now. Creatures running by instinct can trip, but only those thinking can be clumsy. One man's private motto was, "Bite my ass," in conjunction with the act of always backing up on himself. Then there was this other chap who said in regard to his mind that he always kept it on its toes, till someone pointed out to him that minds don't have toes, and he replied, "I know. That's why you got to stay on top of them." During his studies of things apparently transcendental, one man had to pause as he encountered reports of certain activities and ask himself, how comes it that we find men attempting to expand their normal state of constricted consciousness by pursuing even more confining ones of a translite nature? And the Durango Buddha barked out his orders to the trail hands as they began to surround the neural herd. Okay, either get them on their toes or move them on out. Tonight's big question. Is knowing the secret, you reckon, the supreme seriousness or the ultimate liberation from what has heretofore passed for seriousness? One guy wondered, how comes it that instinct runs my face, but intellect my tongue? The reason you should never try to look a leopard in the mouth is that it will not tell you not to do it. Men have frequently said that the bad among us are more active than the good among us. Well, yes, and that the norm doesn't have to be as constantly active since it is in control. Similar situation in an individual's mental structure. Peripheral ideas are often the most active in notice, while those faithful to the collective majority still domineer. One man said, people who have a point to make me uneasy. Maybe that's why I like mystics. The sound of instinct and the voice of otherwise. The more you speak from the mind, the more you tend to whine. Why is that, Daddy? When one man heard the civil reproof that gossip produces more gossip, he said, big deal, even the wellspring of all things civilized, thought, itself produces even more thought. As the wounded man looked up into the doctor's covered face above him, he said, I may be dead, but I'm not that dead. Additional rounds in the sport of another way to tell. Another way to tell the difference between a real mystic and the armchair variety is that the latter always have heroes and models from the past to whom they can compare themselves, always managing to come up short. But the active warrior who knows has no concept of anyone before him having achieved that which he now sees within his grasp. It would be sad, the number of those claiming to want to see Istanbul, who've been placated instead by being shown brochures supposedly of the city, were it not for the fact that it was possible to so placate them. A lack of certain B vitamins and too much attention to the past can both cause the tips of your fingers to swell up. Further excursions into the game of if. If the secret were described in plain, direct words, the simple would find it to be too complex, while the more sophisticated would think it too simple. So, that being the case, who might those who know tell it to? Ever since man left the world of only instinct and gained the additional one of thought, he still felt that he has somehow lost something. How curious that he has gained something, yet simultaneously feels that he has lost something. Who else but a creature who can think could pull off such a miraculous stunt? Intelligence is not a prerequisite for leading a pack, whether speaking of wolves or of men. A certain man one day stopped along the way, leaned against a tree and thought, if the way you know for sure that someone doesn't know what they're talking about is the fact that they'll talk to you about what they know, then where the hell are you going to go for any real info? The longer he stood there reflecting on what he had just asked himself, the more grateful he was for the presence of the tree. And now for a pop quiz. How can you discourage a real mystic? You mean besides killing him? Perhaps I sprang that one on you too fast. There was once a planet ruled by two powers, the Ice Queen and the Coleman Lantern. Everyone exists in a power grid, and to ever see it requires you short-circuit your immediate connections. One of the unappreciated pleasures of being sick is that it helps focus a man's attention on a single spot. Another chapter in, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as a comprehensive mental model of anything, especially of life or man. This is why, even outside the world of gaming, men repeat the adage, read 'em and weep. An ordinary mind is never fully satisfied with what it's done. Inside of every person is two persons, a silent one and a verbal one. And even though one of these can speak, communication between the two is almost non-existent. Many of the great mythical castles, from an outsider's position, seem to stand silent. But this is not necessarily the final word on the matter. Just as only rabid raccoons come out in the daytime, only mad nights make much of a public commotion. If instinct equates to being alive, then what does thinking amount to? Conversation overheard just outside a certain mountain range. I bet nobody knows what goes on inside the mind of a mystic. Well, nobody knows what goes on inside anybody's mind. Yeah, but I bet even more so with a mystic. Some things normally found in the survival kits of the simple. It's a list. Modifiers, conditions, exceptions, binary calculators, complaints, and love of crowds. A wolf pup asked its father, "What does it take to be happy?" And his elder replied, "Above all, don't think." And in their instance, it works. How about in yours? Though unknown to the listening public, most of the mythical chivalrous tales they hear originated with knights who lost their mounts. And a man asked, "Well, if we cannot trust what we hear, especially from mystical sources, then what are we to trust?" Precisely, my good man, precisely. Intelligence, like everything else unique to man's world, can be discussed, but never comprehensively described. Another reason people prefer seeing elephants on display at the zoo rather than mathematicians. Further observations regarding the relative voices of instinct and the mind. Biology forcefully shouts. Psychology attempts to. If life makes itself up as it goes along, then a mystic is one who can give the best description and running commentary of the events as they unfold. The simple straining to be original is like a pig trying to shit a statue. But, as evidence that justice continues to prevail, the swine lobby in response contacted us to say oink. For his birthday, one man gave himself what he had been so dearly wanting. He shut up. In the middle of his great adventure, a certain knight found himself under attack from a horrid three-headed dragon, and for some time dealt with it by alternately turning his attention to first one head, then the other, and then back to the first one, ever repeating the process. Increasing in understanding, the day came when he pulled out his pistol and shot the beast in its single, common heart. And from last 1 or 2 nights ago, there was a news item that has been rewritten of which I wanted you to be aware. Here it goes. See if it now makes any more sense. Outrider addendum to the Civil Crowd Control and Riot Containment Handbook. All conflicts escalate, though this is often a misnomer for the natural flow of progress. And I was going to pick up a little bit about the tenuous connection between the inventions of man's mind and all subsequent attempts to describe and analyze it. But I won't. But before we get to that, several from tonight. Throughout history, up until today, people who get at all interested in such as this, amongst them, it is very common for someone to finally ask or to register an observation that they feel somehow that they have lost something. It's a very old story, thousands of years old, even by the standards of routine public history. And it is also equally as ancient amongst those who believe that they're involved with some extraordinary effort. That even if they have found some apparent discipline, some philosophy, some school that they attempt to follow, and may even believe that they are in a better position than they were when they were still looking, it seems very common the day comes that no matter what they've done, no matter how well they may think of their experience thus far, they still want to register in very sincere terms how they feel in spite of all they've done, in spite of all the efforts they've made, and whatever apparent extraordinary experiences they may have been a part of thus far. They still feel as though somewhere in their deep soul of souls, heart of hearts, and whats of whats, that they have lost something. And it follows just as commonly after that for them to at least tacitly express a desire for someone to explain it. And if not tacitly, they directly will state what seems rational enough, that if someone knows what this loss is and would describe it to them, tell them what it is, then they would be in a better position to try and do something about it. Which you might note as a variation of my description of you're itching and you don't know where to scratch. But it sounds perhaps a bit more metaphysical, a bit more spiritual and personalized to work with the idea that people feel as though they've lost something. The strange part, or the curious part, as was noted in the news item, and after I did all those descriptions of it being common and about other people, I will assume that everyone at all interested in such as this has had or continues to have periodic feelings of, something is missing. And you can get involved in looking externally, or you can get involved in looking internally, or you can get to the point that would sort of be the minimal level of someone who had any idea of what this was about, and they simply do not try and place the locus of the loss either externally or internally, because they simply they accept the fact that they feel a loss. Whether it be a loss of something external, which you should be past that, because then you believe that you have lost touch with a grail, or that you have actually lost a magical object, or that you actually had a physical soul at one time and you lost it through your forefathers or through humanity's misstep with higher forces. But assuming that you're past a fairly childish level of thinking that you actually lost something of a material nature, the loss is a feeling, the loss is an experience. But also note that historically, it is the rule when people express it at all. They do not say that they feel as though there's something they have yet to find. And even if you take the story in the Western version, the most common that I have pulled out, the idea of the Grail, when the king sends out this knight to go find the Grail, or when the forces there in the castle say that our true ruler is ill, go find the Grail, they do not, the inference is not that he has got to go find some new medicine, that he has got to go find some new herb, some new treatment that is yet to be either discovered or to adequately propose and produce. It is on the basis that there is a cure, but it has been lost, it has been misplaced. So the whole idea of a return to Eden, a return to paradise, a return to a better place, always notice it's always a return to. So it is not, when I quote these people as saying they feel as though they've lost something, it is not the basis that they suddenly feel that there is a lacking on their part and that they must go find it and they do not actually know what it is. or that they feel as though it is something apart from that which they have previously had. It is always a feeling that we have lost something, which is, of course, the same reason that from any ordinary view, if men attempt to engage in any form of prognostication, they go, oh, everything's going to hell. It's always the same thing. It's based upon the same dynamic. But at any rate, it is a thing that something has been lost, to make the point. And right now, the point, there was not a conclusion to say that they were incorrect. But do note that the common feeling throughout the public forms of religion and to the lesser known forms of the so-called mystical schools and etc., every time this is expressed, it's expressed as man has lost something. Now they may say that man is searching for something, but it will always be inherent in there, either quite bluntly, or as I said, tacitly, to the point that if the followers of it were questioned, they would agree that, yes, what we're looking for is something that we have somehow lost. We have lost the thread, we have lost our way. All of the great adventure stories, all the great chivalrous stories, Dante, Pilgrim's Progress, the interpretations normally of Christianity itself, that we have lost something, and of course the idea of original sin, that we have lost something. That this hollowness, this lacking that we feel is not for something brand new. It is a loss. Now back to what the news item said the curious part was. Man is the only creature of which he can be aware that has actually gained anything. There is no sign whatsoever. Just take the ordinary view. There's no fossil evidence. There's no fossil hints. Just man understands it. There's enough observation. He knows that hippopotami, in the long history of that grand river pig, that there is no noticeable progress on the hippo's part. Hippos have not picked up any new abilities. In fact, as you might not know it, but amongst mystical zoologists, there's no term, once a hippo, always a hippo. But they don't normally want that put out in public, but since it fits tonight's comments. Man is the only creature from any ordinary view, forgetting imagined metaphysical, metaphorical even, mishandlings of what I'm saying. Just at every ordinary view, man looks around this planet. He can look at life all the way from fossils to what ordinary people want to call common sense. It just strikes you as correct that creatures have not picked up anything new. All you have to do is look at the sentient world, and even though some animals fly and some swim and some crawl and some run and some have feathers and some have fur, they're all equal in this one respect. They all lack an intellect. They've never gone past that level. And by any ordinary observation, you can also, at least partially metaphorical, look at each human as progressing and starting out, that each little nipper, each little baby there in the maternity ward is not much better off than a fledgling turtle, a newborn eaglet, but he very quickly picks up something else, or he begins to display something else. That he gains an intellect. All he's got to do is live long enough, and if he's genetically reasonably sound, his intellect, he gains an intellect. He goes from being no more than, speaking at the basic level, he is no more than a creature of instinct, just a little kid for the first many days and months. He is no better off. He is amounts to not much more than a young puppy, a young kitten. But then he gains something, the intellect. And that alone singles him out. That is his one claim to uniqueness. So the news item pointed out that there was a certain curiousness to this. That man knows all this. I'm not saying anything that's astounding. That ordinary men know. All they got to do is follow my description. There's no sales in it, and they can't really deny it from all common, ordinary knowledge. Then a routine mind will say, you're correct, man, compared to every other creature that we can see, of which we're normally aware, Man is the only one who has gained anything. He is born one thing, but then in the normal course of his existence, he gains something else entirely different, comparably speaking. That is, a birdlet, an eaglet, is born unable to fly, but don't say that along the normal course of its maturity it learns to fly. Yes, but it did not gain anything new. I mean, animals everywhere fly. There are all sorts of flying creatures. It's not that it gained a new ability. Flying is just, you look at a little baby eaglet and you see a thing that, if you'd never seen one, if you had any sense, you'd look down, and if you said, what means of locomotion do you think this little creature, whatever it is, will end up having? And if you've got any sense at all, you're not going to say, well, it's probably going to grow up and have a subway pass, or maybe its father will buy it a Jeep. You simply look at it and you understand it's going to be natural. If this little, whatever it is, I've never seen anything, but if this thing reaches its full maturity, it will fly. If you had never seen a human and you saw it, and there it is, it's doing the very things. You had a little human there and you'd never seen a human, and next to it you had a puppy or an eaglet, and they seem to have a lot in common. Their heads are bobbing around, their eyes won't focus, and they're going, feed me. They're doing it in the bed and all over you, and they're not housebroke, and you would say, well, they have much in common. But you would look at the puppy in the 4 feet. You didn't see any signs of wings. If you'd never seen one, you'd assume that you can't say it's going to develop the ability to run. It's not an acquisition that it gains. It's just part of its natural process, in the same way that you should have been able to look at an eaglet, even if you knew not what species it was, and realize eventually it will fly. But nothing that you could see that will naturally become a part of an eagle's life can be said to be a new acquisition. It is not something that has gained outside of what have been obviously the normal individual evolutionary processes in one lifetime. But you look at a baby, and if you've never seen one, there's no way you can look at it. They're kicking its feet and rolling its eyes and googling and slobbering on itself and go, for some reason that creature strikes me that if it keeps growing, it gets to be a few years, it's going to develop, I don't know what to call it, but something else is going to happen that's just extraordinary compared to these other two things. There's no way you can do that. There's nothing to look at. There's nothing to base it upon. It just happens. The point that the news item was attempting to make rhetorically was to say, is it not curious? Man being the only creature by his own observation. I wouldn't have to sell him on. All he's got to do is listen to what I said and use his own, if he didn't like any of my words, and he realized, yes, you're right. On this planet, everything of which we're normally aware, man is the only creature beyond his instinctive biosurvival world gains anything. He gained an intellect. He gained the ability to think. He has that over every other creature. Nobody even comes close. The news item says, ask the musical, if not rhetorical question, is it not curious? Here it is, the one creature who has gained something beyond the instinctive level is the only one who thinks that he has lost something. You don't find that at all interesting? Duh. How about the tenuous connections then? If you recall last time, I was pointing out the tenuous connections between the products of man's mind, as once man can think, and he then begins to produce that which is beyond the required level for instinctive biological survival. And I pointed out that all of the outputs of man's mind, every aspect of civilization, everything that man has produced that is not directly required for physical survival, that everything that's a product of man's mind functionally ends up having a most tenuous connection with any of his subsequent attempts to analyze and describe what it is that he has wrought. And I was using an example of advertising, and specifically advertising of a new automobile model, and pointing out that if you just suddenly were shown whatever this year's campaign for the Glutzenheimer GT7, and you saw the full print ads and nowadays the television commercials, and you saw the photographs, you saw the movies, you saw all of the shots that they were doing of the car doing its tricks and sitting and in sexy light from various angles, and the voiceover, it would appear to be that everything was a unified whole, that it was truly an intricate, thought out, full plan, that everything they were saying, once you saw it once or twice, like everything that seems to be new, it takes you several times, but if you gave it any attention at all, and it was artistically done, it becomes successful. Screw artistically done. If it becomes successful, then it fits my criteria to fit this example. If it's successful, they run it more than several times. And you see the several different versions of the ad campaign more than several times. And it begins to strike you, whether you're interested in a car, whether you're interested in art, whether you're interested in advertising, if you just give it any attention at all, you're sitting there and it's, the remote's broke and you can't get it off the channel, so you watch it. And it strikes you then. You don't analyze, but it strikes you as being almost a small little work of art, because it is so unified that all of the voiceover, all the descriptions of the car, their punchline of the Stutzenheimer GT, no, not just a car, a state of mind. That it strikes you that all of that, that is a nice piece of work. Because it strikes you, I was giving you other examples of them showing retroactively, showing some of the designers. Several years back, they flashed a little graphic down there, and they show these designers with Eastern martial art types clothes, or apparently Zen type robes, wandering around in a rock garden. And it's these Western guys with glasses and pot bellies and cigars, but they're looking reflective. And they show this whole thing showing, insinuating how much work and planning went into this car to come up with something completely new. And then they show the shots of it, and they describe why it is new, why the form has changed in a certain way, why they started off from zero again. They threw away all of their past ideas of what a car should be and started all over, trying to take a holistic worldview. They do all of this, and it begins, you think, that is nice. Until you think about the fact, which is no secret, it's no secret whatsoever, that the advertising, the people who wrote the ad copy had absolutely no input whatsoever to the design and production of the car. It was done after the fact. It was done years after the design had already been done. And yet you see it in your mind when it works, when it's successful. And we're not saying it works by my definition. If the damn campaign's successful and it sells cars, that's what we're talking about. Then it worked. And people felt as though this is a whole piece of art. This is a whole piece of one work. The advertising fits. But to call it a tenuous connection is actually charitable. There was no connection. But tenuous connection sounds better. Anytime you can do something just this side of a dogmatic statement, you always give the simple and the childish a way out, and it gives people with some potential the ability to hear the conditioned version and then maybe on their own go, wait a minute, tenuous hell, there's none. So it's up to you. But the tenuous connection between that. I was going to point out after all of that, there's also another one I didn't hit, but I was going to give you the supreme example, but just before that, how about also I'll give you a certain amount of, I'll impose upon you a certain amount of credit that you often, or at least sometimes, can smell a certain kind of singular aroma, and not necessarily pleasant or logical, between, let us say, art, the creative arts, and the criticism thereof. And I have read enough news items here that appeared to be, if taken simply, as some sort of attack on criticism. Criticism is necessary, but from a certain view, we're not getting into any sort of critique of academic and artistic criticism any more than that. What I just said, the first example is a criticism of advertising. It's not the point. But all of you, at some time or other, should have been reading a review of a book, of a movie, of music, of painting, of sculpture, and you're reading a review that apparently is a serious review, that is, it's in a reputable publication, some man perhaps listed with those letters behind his name, showing they finished high school at least. Putting HS behind your name, by the way, I've noticed. Maybe I'm behind, but it doesn't open many doors anymore. At any rate. Maybe it's too few letters. Maybe we should make it HSG, high school graduate. Maybe that's where I went wrong. Maybe they just put HS and they just think, well, wait a minute. He may have just gone to high school. I mean, who knows? He could have, dropped out in the 10th grade. No, that's free in case any of you want to try it. It might work better to add the G. At any rate, it'll be, I'm not going to try to make up any more examples than I think I did my share making up that ad campaign for my fictitious ad agency having to do with my fictitious car. But you have surely been reading a review. Perhaps it started out of a movie you'd heard about or an author of some that interests you. And here it is, his brand new novel or his brand new director's movie. And you like him and you start reading it. Now maybe you've even seen it. It gets to be relevant. But the point is you're reading along and it begins to smell in a certain way. And there's no other word than say smell. You either are going to grasp what I'm pointing to or not. And it's not that the man is wrong. It's not that you think, well, an idiot. It just, what you begin to smell. You get to be uneasy about it. And if somebody popped in and could read your mind, as they say, and go, did you know that's making you uneasy? And you went, well, you're right. And then if you said, well, why? Then they would begin to explain it away. And it would not point to what I'm trying to point at. That's why I'm having to be inspecific. Because they would take it as being an entree, or at least they have been invited to comment, which they would have to do, and then they would simply begin to attack the critic. It's not to attack the critic. But when it begins to strike you that something is funny, something is rotten, what you are sensing is the tenuous connection between that which man produces mentally and then that which he subsequently tries to analyze. Because you're making a mistake to take the critic as being separate from the artist. It's all internal to life. It's all within this closed system. Life produced this artist over here, this author, this composer. He then, in turn, working for the big guy, apparently turned out this new symphony, this new Broadway play, this new novel. But life also produced, one person can't dance. This will not work in a four-dimensional or an even-dimensioned universe. In reality, you've got to have two people to do that dance. So life also produces a critic. The critic is just as important in the particular field of arts, and you have critics in other areas of life, all other areas, they're just not known as critics. In the arts, they just got down and cut out all the bullshit and just called them what they were, a critic. Well, they didn't cut out all the bullshit. If they'd cut out all the bullshit, they wouldn't have called them a critic. They'd simply call them the enemy or the opposition, better yet. But at any rate, when you smell that, and I'm not going to try to explain it anymore because this was not where I was going anyway, but I have no doubt that many of you, now that I've mentioned it, have had that experience. And it might not just be reading. Nowadays, you've got so many critics that you can see live, so to speak, on television, for instance. And there they are. You can see their face and their gestures and all, and they'll say, well, here's our resident movie expert. And there'll be some guy, and they'll say, he's got 4 books out. He's recognized as one of the world's leading critics on the art of American cinema, or cinema. And they do all this, and so he takes off, and they say, well, you're going to tell us about so-and-so, and they name some famous director. And about his brand new blockbuster, been in the works now for 3 years. And he goes, yes. So this guy starts. Camera's out on him. He's all dressed up. He uses, has a nice vocabulary, and he starts, and he throws in a few French terms, and he uses the word cinema instead of movie. But he does some of this, and he gets going. And you're interested, let us say, in this particular director's past works, and you heard about the movie, so you give it some attention, and he starts, Right? He's admitting what some of the great works he's done in the past, or some of the at least formidable efforts he has past done. And he goes, blah, blah, blah. And it suddenly begins to take on a certain kind of, at least, it's like a vitriolic patina. I mean, and usually it'll be that, rather than just an outright attack on the man. But anyway, he begins to, nah, 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 nah. And he begins to, it's almost like a little Pekingese beginning to, nip at the heels of a linebacker. And he goes on it. And at first it sounds like it's going to be an intellectual criticism of the man's latest work. And he goes, well, nah, 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 nah. And the more he talks, do you remember the news item tonight that had to do with the different sounds coming from the instinct and the mind? It says, the more you talk from the mind, the more you tend to whine. So the man starts, this critic goes, well, da 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 da, da 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 da. And if you listen, this is not the proof of it, but it'll be such things when it really gets into the area that I am trying to more closely limb in a vague sort of way. Their pitch will even change. Their voice will get higher. He'll begin to whine. And it's almost as though, and that's when you begin to think, wait a minute, this has gotten past the point of artistic criticism. I don't know what's going on, but maybe the guy snubbed him one time. Maybe this director owes him money. Maybe, he slept with his wife. It just seems like this is more than artistic criticism. This is beginning to, it just doesn't seem right. Forget all the other examples, possibilities I just made up. Maybe he did sleep with his wife, maybe he owes him money. But when you distinctly have that sensation, what it is the unrealized, the undescribed awareness of the tenuous connection between what men do. In this case, they produce a movie. Let's wrap it up and give this guy his real due. He wrote, he produced, he directed the damn thing. He is of such repute that he is the kind of filmmaker that his name goes above. Francis James Jesse. Jesse's the great Humla. That his name goes up there. He is the artist. All right, so here it is. Here's something that man's mind has produced. Here comes a critic. Because I gave you the easy way. Well, maybe I gave you the hard way. Almost as bad. But anyway, here's the critic. The best that life can produce under the conditions right now. And he begins to explain and analyze a production of man's mind. And any connection between the two is at best tenuous. As I said, I perhaps could have given you a harder and easier one. I pointed this out before. I'll leave it to your judgment. Almost as problematic, if not spooky, is under certain conditions, when times are just right, whatever it takes, is to ask the artist himself to explain his work. At times that can even get scarier. It's him trying to explain. That is sort of the perhaps pathetic, unintended humor of hearing an artist comment on his own work, to analyze it. And especially the more he tries to be, gives the appearance of being objective, clinical, cold-blooded. Yes, I can look at my own work and I can tell you exactly what I had in mind. And he starts, and it's even worse. You think, I got to turn this off. This man's going to explode, or his eyes are going to bulge out, and he's going to pop through the TV and eat my liver. All right, I was going to give you the extreme example, though, of the tenuous connections between that which man's mind produces and all subsequent attempts to analyze and to explain it. The ultimate, the supreme example is anything that man thinks about life. Does that narrow it down? Well, in fact, once I'm assuming that some of you people are to the point that you understand narrowing down can functionally operate in just the opposite direction, that we'll assume that if any of you were doing an imitation of ordinary minds, for me to say, well, that narrows it down, and you laughed, the laughter being, well, how ironic that you put it that way, because it does anything but that. But wait a minute. to make it all-inclusive does narrow it down, because once you see that, then it's narrowed it down. There's nothing, nowhere else to look. But once you understand that it's everywhere, then you don't not have to waste your time looking for examples. Like, well, specifically, in what area might this be operational? Yes. Yes, indeedy. No. I ask who's on first. Yeah, right. Where might I look to see this occurring, perhaps in everyday life? Just anywhere you like? Oh, no. I want to know specifically. Everything that the mind thinks about life is the supreme example. That swallows advertising, the connection between my fictitious advertising campaign and the Gruntweiler GT7, between art and art criticism. All of those are just tidbits, because it's anything that the mind thinks. Then could I point out that if you ever, once you begin to realize that, let's put it that way, once you realize that, the tenuous connection between what man thinks and the specific example, the all-inclusive example being anything that the mind thinks about life, you then realize that the supreme example of tenuous connection, in quotation marks, is anything that the mind thinks about life and the reality of living. The connection, I guess we're going to have to beat our plowshares back into dictionaries again, but I'm searching for some other way besides tenuous connection, to say nothing. But consider the connection, the relationship, as it ordinarily occurs and is ordinarily extant, the explanation of any and all minds, including your own minds, the mind, anything that the mind says about life compared to the actuality of living the damn thing. Now, with ordinary people, if they'd followed it this far, that would probably be the end of it, because that would either make no sense or they'd just say, well, that's silly. Some of the examples were almost entertaining, but that's not true. It is true. Well, if you see it that way, it's true. How about that? But if you do begin to see the absolutely, at the maximum, tenuous connection between anything that the mind says about life and compared to the reality of living life, if you ever see that, then may I point out that it is very difficult after that to have any faith, any interest at all in anything the mind has to say. But see, good. But notice, I pointed out the truth. If an ordinary person had listened to it thus far for 50 minutes, and I heard the thing about advertising and me talking about film directors and critics, and they could go, yeah, that's true. Sometimes it's like two different things. Now I say, but all right, forget all that. Let me give you the example. I mean, it's the only one you need. It's the supreme. Supreme in its, I guess, well, maybe it has a connotative, but in its literal sense, the final, the ultimate, the paramount, the conclusive example of this tenuous connection. I should have built it up maybe a little bit and give people time to get a pad and pencil and say, all right, now here's the example. Anything that the mind says about life, that is the supreme example. See, that's when an ordinary mind would shut down the whole process. It would completely deny it, as it would have to, because there must be exceptions. Or contraire, there must be examples that support my comment. But if there are simply some examples that support it, then that tacitly leaves exceptions to what I state as a dogmatic rule. That is, there are things that men think about life that do have some pertinence, that are directly connected to the reality of living life, if you say so. I mean, to respond other than that is to be an idiot. Not that they're wrong, but it just means that they will never see past that. That means that they're normal, sane, decent people by God. Not crackpots like watch this kind of thing. I mean, not like people that watch this sort of shit. Well, you know what I mean. But consider, once you see, assuming you do, the absolutely, to understate it, tenuous connection between what the mind, what anybody's mind, an ordinary sane person now is always speaking of, unless specifically noted otherwise. Don't take it personally. That anything that the mind thinks about, the tenuous connection, the supreme example, remember, is anything that the mind thinks about life compared to the reality of living it. Now, even with a good strong finger and hand gesture, you cannot make an ordinary person see that if they're not wired up to ever see it, because it's just simply prima facie incorrect. They would say, well, in fact, that is the operational definition of civilization. That what we think about life, that is, our thoughts about what we do, is the whole basis of human progress. Well, that's true. I'm the one that told them that. Don't try to take that kind of shit and pull it back on the person that told you, but all right, I'll let it go. Yes, it is. That doesn't change what I said. If you ever see that the connection between what man's mind says about life and then the reality of living, if you ever see that you indeed have what amounts to two voices inside, the instinctive and the mental, and that the relationship between what the mental says is going on and the way the instinct has to live life. Assuming again that you're saying because your instinct is what lives you life, if your mind is what was really in charge of you, all of you would be, everybody sitting here and listening to this on TV would be short one leg, 2 or 3 fingers, an eye. They'd have severe mental brain damage from blows about the head. If it was up to the mind, I threw in one tonight that I didn't get around to use an example that says creatures running solely by instinct can trip, but only those that can think are clumsy. There's a difference. An ordinary person can never see that there is such a difference, and they can never see that there is actually an observable. You cannot prove it, I cannot describe it, and nor would I try to. It's a waste of time. But there is a tenuous connection, to say the least, let's go back to that, between what the mind says life is all about. And I don't mean in some philosophical sense that each person's mind says, well, here's what we have to do to live, here's our plans for the day, here's the way we've got to look, here's the way we've got to act, here's what we've got to do in life to ever get anywhere. This is the way in which we've got to get somewhere that'll amount to anything. Here it is, and your mind says that. It is the supreme, it is the crowning glory of man on this planet compared to an elephant. I'll let that go, just people like to believe that, but that is the mind, and it's the mind saying that. But friends and neighbors, and you ex-Baptists, I got to point out to you, your mind is not what runs your life. That was why you laughed when I said if your mind actually had the control over your particular life that it says it has, all of you would be short an eye, a foot, some fingers. Most of you would be dead, probably. Or you'd be in a hospital. There is a difference between what the mind says life's about and the reality of living life. And I guess we'll pick it up there next time if there is a next time. That make it?